morning, everybody. Hello. Welcome to the 25th Annual Multicultural Education Conference. Woohoo! Thank you for being here early on a Saturday. All right. I am Jenna Porter, here with my conference co-chair, Dale Allender, and we'd like to begin this silver anniversary conference by thanking the elders of the Miwok Nation for their care and stewardship of this land where we meet today, going back for many years before our arrival. We hope that this practice of land acknowledgement serves to create awareness of the true history that has led us to this point in time, to offer recognition and respect, and to inspire action for institutionalizing this practice.
Our 25th year celebration happens at a time when many incidents locally and globally remind us, in fact, urge us to continue the work that we're doing here and to work to urge you to continue to do the work that you're doing out in the world as well. We certainly mentioned the brave work of community members on behalf of Stefan Clark. We also acknowledge the most recent incident in New Zealand, although we know many other incidents in our recent times have called us to attention as well. So we're here celebrating 25 years, and we are doing so to urge all of us to really dig in our heels and continue our work for justice.
More than doubled, but just this morning we checked the registration numbers and it's tripled. It has tripled. We have over 1,000 folks that are registered for this conference today. So please be patient. In this space, in the hallways, in the rooms, they will likely be very crowded, so please be patient with that. Also, because of our increased numbers, we've sort of outgrown this union space. So several sessions will be outside of this union area across campus. And this map is in your conference program. We also have some strands, some particular related strands we want to tell you about. So some of our Sac State faculty and student sessions will be next door in the West building in AIRC. That is what you see in green right here. I'm sorry, it's purple. Purple. We have an ethnic studies strand that will be happening over in Mendocino Hall, and that's what you see here in green. The California Indian Curriculum Summit will be held over in Eureka Hall. That's the orange building that you see there. And the Center for Black Literature and Latinx Literature strands will be here in two separate spots in the Union. Check your conference programs for details on which sessions and where they are. We will also have our fabulous student volunteers ushering you all out of the building to the direction that you need to go. Again, please be patient with the crowds. So we also want to welcome all of our colleagues and folks that are facilitating these strands. They're really wonderful parts of this conference, and so thank you for being here and doing that.
All right, so I get the happy occasion of not just noting our numbers and talking about the importance of patience and caution, etc., but to celebrate folks who've come, right? Our script from the last several years says we have over 700 folks. Well, we have been. We've been building in that regard, and as noted, we've expanded further. So I'm going to note just some of the places where we've got folks coming from. We certainly have folks coming from all over the country, as far south as LA, as far east as New York, and also parts down south and further north. I'm going to highlight just a few folks and give some shout outs. Regionally, we have folks from Sac State Unified School District. Where are you? Are you out there? How about San Juan Unified School? All right. Sac City, San Juan put you to shame on that one. You want to shout out again? All right. And that's an alum, too. Right? Natomas Unified School District, David. All right, Natomas. Right. How about Elk Grove? So we also want to thank our sister CSB campuses, Fresno, San Jose, Monterey, Northridge, and Stanislaus. And further, we welcome all of our community college partners as well that are with us today. Now, we're going to offer a warm welcome to some folks who are coming to our conference for the first time. Namely, we would welcome faculty from Iowa State University. Iowa State. We also want to welcome community partners, Robinson's Taekwondo, who's here with several senior instructors. Fabulous to watch their pedagogy and how they interact with students and teachers. We also want to acknowledge Crystal Harris and Ebony Thomas coming to us from Harvard Graduate School of Ed for their first time at our conference. Amir Whitaker from the ACLU Southern California branch. Finally, as noted a couple moments ago, we're going to welcome back the Center for Black Literature, Medgar Evers Community College. We're going to highlight and welcome back Lauren Merrifield from 808ed.com, Tony Diaz, and the return of all of our College of Ed alumni who are here with us today as well.
So this conference would not be possible at all without the sponsorship and support of a variety of entities. So thank you to our College of Education Conference Committee. Where are you in this room? They are amazing. Stand up, would you please? They may be running around like a car right now. It takes so many of us to put something like this on. One of our committee members actually just had a baby 3 weeks ago. So Sarah, we're videotaping. I just want to acknowledge her. She did a lot of work as well. Thank you also specifically to our spouses and children. Mine are over here, yours will be here, for all the work that they also put into this, the time and support. Oh, there's Fabiola and Anansi. We're thanking you for your time and support here as well. And of course, we want to thank the dozens of student volunteers that make this happen. They're the ones pounding the pavement, setting up the bags, doing a lot of the work that you're going to see today. So students, we do this for you. You're amazing. Thank you for all of us that are doing today. We also receive support from our Dean's Office, our Doctorate in Educational Leadership program, that we have a poster session where they're presenting today. President Nelsen and Academic Affairs, Instructionally Related Activities, California Teachers Association, the Center for Black Literature, Eaton Interpreting, Jelly Belly, yeah, they're in your bags, folks, Jelly Belly. Teaching Tolerance and all the goodies in your bags from them, and then of course the dozens of other sponsors that are listed in your program. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So, we're at 25. We're at 25. When we celebrate a 25-year anniversary, it offers us a wonderful occasion of acknowledging folks who have helped institute and initiate this event that we're having here today. We spent some time, actually, and as my co-chair mentioned, the support of our families, it's come in very concrete ways. So we spent some time with folks who originated this conference and had the opportunity to hear their oral narratives about their original intent and purpose. My daughter, Aria, videotaped and edited a real short clip. So we're going to get to hear from them. We're going to get to hear just a little bit about why they did what they did, and how that is important today. And then we'll honor them with an award.
That was actually the very first conference when I was the chair. This chart was focused up on the wall.
There it is. The what we were doing. Power contains nothing without demand and never has. And look who he's quoting. Look who he's quoting.
You have to understand that the conference came out of the new department. So we created a new department of bilingual education, bilingual multicultural. Now we've been building that for 12 years, but we became a department in 1994.
Wow.
And what we wanted to do to start with was we wanted to first tell everybody, hey, we're here. So conference was started, and
In
the
95.
first goals were to basically just assert our presence. But then another goal was, we had previously graduated hundreds of teachers, hundreds of bilingual teachers. And so we wanted to get back.
I'm one of them, by the way.
Want to get back in touch with them to nourish them because they were stuck in schools by themselves. And then the third goal was we put a lot of teachers out as student teachers, and we wanted to invite the host teachers in because we wanted to close the gap between the university and supervision of student teaching. Now, many of those host teachers.
It was easy to vote him in as the first chair. So that was September 1994. I think like a month later, and I don't know how, we must have brought it up to the department. Said, you know what, we should have a conference. It was kind of like that, we should have a conference. And he said, cool. Wayne conducted a project, which continued to this day, by the way. And then Maggie and I, and you and Jenna continue to abide by. And this was a term that wasn't even coined yet. But number one, Dwayne said, this is open to the public. Students, we're bringing back students, faculty on campus, obviously folks on the college. It's going to be open to everybody and anybody. Number two, it's going to be free. We're not going to monetize it.
That the mission statement that was created by you all was not only that, but as a graduate of the program, remember that it was to keep the networking going.
Yeah,
Not just keep it open to the public, but to keep it open to past students, past alumni who could continue to go. I remember one of the mission statements was also that teachers could not afford to go to a professional conference, and this was a way to allow for past graduates as well as the current students to not only network, but to attend.
Okay, so we would now like to honor the founding chairs of this conference, Dr. Maggie Beto, Dr. Green, and Dr. Jose Cinturon. We want to thank them for their vision and commitment to our community, our students, particularly students of color, to the College of Education, and for the critical transformation of school and society that their work has achieved. Dwayne was supposed to be here today. His name tag was out there, and I'm looking around for him. Dwayne, are you here in the room? And we just didn't catch you? No, okay. And Jose and Maggie also really wanted to be here, but they couldn't be here today. So what I'd like to do is invite Dr. Margarita Berta Avila on stage to accept the awards for Jose and Maggie.
Good morning, everyone. How are we feeling? Let's try that again. How are we feeling? It's a great honor for me to be accepting the awards on behalf of Dr. Jose Cinturon and Dr. Maggie Beto. Both of them, when I came to the Bilingual Multicultural Education Department in 2001, were immediately mentors to me with respect to our role as faculty, but also what our charge is as educators. And that is to not waver at any time what our positions are and the impact of who we are and what we do. That our role is that of creating change, and it is a very political and spiritual role with respect to the environments that we foster, the relationships that we carry with one another, and what we hope to accomplish in the future. And both Maggie and Jose were models for me in that way, and continue to do so in their teachings as they continue in departments and the work that we do. So on behalf of them and their legacies and the work that they are still a part of, I'm honored to accept this award on behalf of them. Thank you very much.
Now, please welcome to the stage the College of Education's Dean, Sasha Sidorkin.
Morning, everybody. So we've been doing this conference for 25 years and planning for 25 more. And I think this kind of stubbornness deserves an explanation. So it's become a tradition, our signature event, a very important event for us. So it's a working group, that's the question. And you all know that we live in interesting, difficult times. There's actually reports of increased number of hate speech and hate incidents by various organizations. At the same time, I want to point your attention to the long-term trends. In the long term, actually, you can see that the prejudice, homophobia, and racism are declining in our society significantly. For example, in 1958, only 4% of Americans believed that an interracial marriage is okay. Now, guess what the percentage is? It's 87%. So, actual FBI reports that the hate crime incidents are going down in the long term, significantly. So there's also a couple of researchers recently published a paper from Harvard that the implicit bias also goes down significantly. In the last 10 years, it just decreased. And of course, the difference is mostly generational. So young people now are less racist, less homophobic, less prejudiced in other ways than their parents, and a lot more than their grandparents. But they didn't get there on their own. Somebody, some teacher, taught them the values of multiculturalism. So that's why I think we have to, we as a profession need to take some credit for it. And we're very far from getting there. There's still a lot of racism and other prejudice going on. But if we keep doing it, it actually works. I just want you to point out that the fight is not defensive. We're on the fence, we're doing the right thing, it's moving in the right direction. Too slow, but it's moving in the right direction. So, I also want to, so that actually the increase in hate speech, it's not because more people are racist, it's because people have been always racist and now feel emboldened to speak. So, which is a very different thing. I also want to use this opportunity to ask nominations to support our other great tradition. It's called the Better Together Community Awards. We ask, in your folders, you'll find it with Harvard information how to nominate community organizations in schools. And I say we keep going for another at least 25 years and then we'll reassess, see if we still need it. Let's keep going, chipping away from the old cement of prejudice, one conference at a time. And all thanks already been said, and I want to welcome on stage one of our biggest supporters here, the Sacramento State's 8th President, Robert S. Nelsen.
How many of you in the room are younger than 25 years old? That says an awfully lot about this conference and about what we're trying to do and about making differences in this world. 25 years is a long time. That's why it's such an honor to work at Sac State and to be able to serve. That's why we have so many dedicated faculty that are here today to support multiculturalism in Sacramento and in the nation. to set an example for everyone about what is possible. Sac State, as I say many times, is the fourth most diverse university west of the Mississippi. But what we are committed to is being the most inclusive university in the United States. And today is just one step. And today we are here to learn, but we are here to honor everyone in this room. In the last few weeks, I've been in this room where we had art performances honoring Stephen Clark. I've been in this room when we had literally thousands of people here because of what happened to Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand. And today, we are here to remember all of them, but we are here to remember that it is our moral responsibility to make sure that we have a better world for all of these young people that are here today, everyone, so that we give them an opportunity. How many of you graduated from Sac State? Well, today, even if you didn't graduate from Sac State, you're a member of our Hornet family, and we are grateful you are here. And as always, Sac State is number one. Stingers up!
All right, so as we get ready to move into our speakers and the rest of the conference, we want to remind everyone the importance of promoting our work out in the community and out in the world. But we don't want you to leave the building. We want you to stay at our conference. So we'd love for you to share your experiences on social media. Twitter, Facebook, live stream, all the various ways in which we are connected. We've given you a hashtag as well as 2 possible places to tag on Twitter as you are communicating out with the world about the experiences that you're having at the conference. So we look forward to seeing you in person, but also online, and see the impact that you have out there as well.
I walked up the stairs that time, I'm all good. So we are really glad to see Dwayne Campbell just walked into the room. So we would like to actually ask him to come up and receive his award. Dwayne, thank you for coming. We had showed the video. Yes, just a few minutes, but thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for coming. It's really amazing to see you all here. And for any of you who need extra information, out on the table there's a document on what to do if ICE comes knocking. Please have copies.
All right, so every year that we have our conference, we're blessed with some amazing speakers that come to inspire us and educate us and urge us to move on with our work. And we have the same this year. Oh, this year our conference is very special given that it's our 25th year anniversary. And so typical conferences have a singular keynote, but this time we have keynotes. We have a musical melody. We have a melody that shows us the rhythm of our work and it encourages us to continue. So we're inviting this year 3 keynote speakers, 2 who have blessed our stage in the past, and 1 for the first time. Our first keynote speaker, what we're going to do is introduce all 3 of them, and then we'll invite them up to sit at the stage and then come and speak one at a time. Each keynote speaker will share a short talk, and then they will also be, throughout the day, having their own separate session so we can have an opportunity to get more in depth with them. So our first keynote speaker that I want to highlight is Dr. Christine Sleeter. We know her as foundational to the work that we're doing. Foundational as a collaborator, but also as an individual scholar. When we asked folks to say who here is a graduate of Sac State, of course in my mind I was thinking about teaching credentials because that's the world that I live in. Every one of these folks in the room who graduated from our teaching credential program are very familiar with the various approaches to writing multicultural objectives, right? That's originated in Christine's collaborative work. Many of you here, both in terms of folks who graduated from our program, but also teachers in the field right now who we are doing in-service with, also know about the various dimensions for social justice education that she's written about. These are foundational works, but even in the most contemporary sense, Christine Sleeter is a foundational scholar in our ethnic studies work, having been commissioned by the National Education Association to really review the literature on what's been said and what's been done, has appropriately enabled us to say that there is both social and academic value in ethnic studies. But even beyond her work with ethnic studies, in the classroom setting, we see a new genre of ethnic studies research emerging from her work in critical genealogy, critical family studies. So Christine truly is both a foundational presence in our work in multicultural education and is someone who has both contemporary salience and is pushing us into the future as well. Our second keynote speaker.
I have the pleasure of introducing our second keynote speaker, Dr. Antonia Darder. Dr. Antonia Darder. This is a very special moment for me because Dr. Darder was my professor as a credential student, and we have continued our relationship as not only workers in the field, but also co-conspirators in creating social change. And so that is an important factor for me. Dr. Antonia is currently a professor of educational leadership at Loyola Marymount University, and her work really at the core is to delineate the current political questions and ethical concerns linked to racism and class inequalities in pedagogical practices. Her work defines truly the opportunity for teachers to reflect on their practice in the context of a macro society and the impact of that at the local level. And then what does that level of analysis mean, not only with respect to our positionality as teachers or even future teachers, but then also the impact that that can have at the school level, at the community level, in creating systemic change. And so necessary to analyze the systemic structures that exist in order to analyze and understand our own practices. So with her work in analyzing the work of Paulo Freire and many others and correlating that to contemporary times, it is definitely a work that continues to influence all of us in order to make a change and difference.
And finally, our third keynote speaker, Dr. Carla Garcia-Fernandez, is a faculty member from California State University, Northridge, in the Deaf Studies Department. I heard one clap, we can get another clap. Dr. Garcia-Fernandez was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico. One of my favorite places in the world is that city, and that state, actually. And she's a graduate of UT Austin. What I want to say about Dr. Fernandez's work is that I think it's a prime example right now of what I want to call critical intersectionality. we were moved to think about the idea of intersectionality in critical race studies not long ago. But unfortunately, one of the things that we've been able to see is that intersectionality often becomes discussed as a stacking of different identities, when in fact, it's much more than that. And it's much more than that. And it's discussed in Fernandez's work in terms of not just the multiple oppressions that one might consider female, of color, deaf, but also of the many opportunities there to transform society from those places on the margin. So we are blessed to have all three of them here with us, and we would like to invite them both to the stage, all three to the stage, and then to have Dr. Sleeter begin the round of conversations.
Good morning. It's a real delight to be here. I can't believe how much this conference has grown. I'm truly honored just to see all of you here in this room and commend the conference organizers for pulling together such a marvelous group. I was asked to speak about the history of critical multicultural education in about 15 minutes. But what I want to do is start by taking you back to the 1970s and asking you to recall the 1970s. Now, I'm aware that many of you weren't around then, or if you were kind of little and can't recall much about the 1970s. So I want to play a little bit of music that might help put us in that space. For me, this was the theme music of learning urban teaching. There were two things that happened in the early 1970s. Actually, there were a lot of things that happened, but two that I'll talk about. One is that I began learning to do urban teaching in Seattle. And the second is that multicultural education as a field came into being. The term multicultural education, as far as I know, first appeared in print in 1973. There's a context here that is super important to understanding multicultural education. That and for me, it still has some visceral resonance. The civil rights movement was beginning to wind down, but the civil rights movement had been actively going on for a number of years. This was almost 20 years after Brown v. Board of Education that declared that racially separate schools were inherently unequal, and school districts across the country were grappling with desegregation, many of them actually resisting desegregation. And in many areas, white parents were establishing white academies to send their own children to so that they could avoid desegregation. There were even places like Prince Edward County in Virginia where the public schools were closed down for 5 years rather than desegregate. And the white kids went to private academies and the African American kids didn't have schooling. In Seattle, where I was, Seattle was undergoing a process of voluntary desegregation. This was about 10 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which declared that public institutions receiving federal funding could not discriminate on the basis of race. This was about half a dozen years after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, and a little less than half a dozen years after the Third World Liberation Front organized the student strikes to protest for ethnic studies. In the wake of desegregation, thousands of African American teachers lost their jobs. White parents didn't want their kids taught by African American teachers who they thought were just simply going to be inferior teachers. And black teachers have had decades of successful teaching experience teaching African American kids. So with black teachers having lost their jobs, the teaching force began to look more like me. White, and at the time, racially totally clueless. In fact, when I entered teaching, I thought that the civil rights movement had taken care of racism. I actually said that to an African-American friend in relationship to housing discrimination. He corrected me, and I learned a lot subsequently. But that kind of shows the level of consciousness that I and a lot of other white teachers brought into teaching. In this context, African-American parents had some huge concerns. One of them was the attitudes of white teachers. And it's almost hard now to grasp the depth with which the ideology of cultural deprivation, how deeply it held sway. And I know that the ideology of cultural deprivation, we still have, but at the time, books had been written about education of the culturally deprived. And some of these were used in teacher education. There were conferences held on teaching culturally deprived kids. There was an actual category in schools where you could be referred to. You might be, if you were behind academically, you might be classified as mentally retarded, you might be classified as a slow learner, or you might be classified as culturally deprived and sent to the classroom, oh, those are the culturally deprived kids. And the African-American parents and educators had huge concerns about that. They also had a number of other concerns, but one of them was the all-whiteness of the curriculum. The parents wanted their kids to have access to the high-quality education that they believed that white kids were getting, but getting into the all-white schools was still kind of a shocker to see the extent to which the curriculum was an all-white curriculum. So the demands by African-American parents and educators, joined by other parents of color, became the basis for multicultural education. Some of these early educators came out of ethnic studies. James Banks and Geneva Gay, for instance, had roots in black studies that they brought with them, and were familiar with the thinking of black intellectuals such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson, and used what they learned in black studies as a way to rethink how schooling could be reshaped. People came out of other ethnic studies as well. One of the early people in multicultural education, Carlos Cortez, who's still around and still writing, as are James Banks and Geneva Gay, came out of Mexican American studies, which he was helping to create in Southern California, as he was trying to help think about what do you do K-12 in addition to what you do at the higher level. So initially, these demands came together called multi-ethnic education and then multicultural education. But it's important to recognize that multicultural education was born in protest and was in many ways revolutionary for its time. And you can read back some of the early works in multicultural education now and think, well, that doesn't sound revolutionary. But at the time, it really was, because it challenged very directly the ideology of cultural deprivation. It challenged racial exclusion in education. It affirmed the rights of historically marginalized communities to have their own culture, their own history, their own identity. And it affirmed, or at least took on the question of who gets to name the problems and the solutions. Now, subsequently, and I'm going to do more of this analysis later in my workshop, but we've had various versions of multicultural education. So today, we could talk about multicultural education, or neoliberal multicultural education, or critical multicultural education. And one might wonder, since the 1970s, what happened? In my later workshop, I'll do a deeper dive into some of what happened. But one of the things that happened had to do with addressing white teachers and white teacher attitudes, which became a major focus of multicultural education. And I think it's a focus that needed to happen, but it had the effect also of blunting how many people understood multicultural education. I was a beginning teacher in Seattle and went through what's probably some of the early trainings in multicultural education looked like. There was a program in Seattle called the Ethnic Cultural Heritage Program that was run by a Japanese American woman who had been a survivor from the Japanese internment camps, Mako Nakagawa, who got money from the Ethnic Cultural Heritage Act funding, which was federal funding to help schools deal with desegregation. One of the things that this group did was organize trainings for teachers, and I went through a couple of them. And what they typically involved was giving teachers content knowledge that teachers didn't have about African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. It was during one of these trainings, for example, that I first learned Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem. Teachers were also given teaching strategies to use in newly desegregated schools. For instance, how do you handle racial name calling? How do you give children the vocabulary to be able to talk about skin differences? At the time, in my own life, I was actually going beyond what the trainings were offering. I had, when I came into Seattle, felt like I was so woefully unprepared for where I was. I realized that my own education had been an all-white education because I was looking around and, like, as I mentioned, I was racially clueless. And as I realized I was racially clueless, then I started reading ethnic studies literature. Initially, just picking things at random, and I'm not sure how much I remembered from some of the first things I read because I didn't have much life experience to hook it onto. But I kept reading and reading and reading, and that eventually mattered. I also, while I was a classroom teacher, developed personal relationships with several African American educators and people who weren't in education. And for me, it was through these personal relationships that I underwent a lot of re-education. But most classroom teachers weren't doing that. Most classroom teachers were going through just the trainings. And just as an example of how the trainings kind of watered down multicultural education, in the early 1980s, when I was completing my PhD with Carla at the University of Wisconsin, he was getting asked by a number of schools to come and do workshops for teachers in multicultural education. And so he would sometimes take his graduate students along as a way of training us to be able to do these workshops. And I remember one workshop where at the end of it, he, after people had left, and he said, "Now, you notice I didn't use the words race and racism." And I said, "Yeah, I noticed, and why didn't you?" And he said, "Okay, think about it. This is an all-white group of teachers. Carla's African American." He said, "I come in. If I talk about teaching strategies, they'll listen to that. If I talk about cultural pluralism, they get squirmy, but they'll listen. If I start talking about race and racism, they're out of here." And I think on a national scale, as what white teachers would listen to kind of helped shape some of the discussion, we ended up with versions of multicultural education that kind of forgot its historic origins in challenging racism. In the 1980s, Carla and I collaborated on the 5 approaches to multicultural education, which I think Sac State has actually been using more of and using better than about any place else I know of in the country. And I say that better because we did it as a tool to distinguish among different meanings of multicultural education and as a way of pushing people toward more complex, more in-depth meanings. But a lot of people haven't used it that way and have used it to sort of legitimate, learning to get along and then stopping there. But just a little backstory on how we even created the 5 approaches. We were doing some work at a junior high in St. Paul. We had done a summer institute there, and then we're doing a follow-up study. And Carla and I and another graduate student when we would get together and talk about what we'd seen in the classrooms and how the teachers were talking about their work. We realized that different teachers had different meanings for multicultural education. So we developed this shorthand language that became the 5 approaches. And then Carl said, I wonder if these are reflected in the published literature on multicultural education. I actually want to read everything that's ever been written about multicultural education. Now, if you think about doing that now, you'd be reading probably, for the next 10 years. But at the time, there were something like 60 articles. So we reviewed them and found the 5 approaches in there, wrote an article, it got published, and then we started writing our books from there. The 1990s, multicultural education continued expanding, but there also became much more of a tension between this is critical multicultural education or benign versions of multicultural education. For example, many states began requiring multicultural education in teacher certification programs. And I remember having debates with people about to what extent are these requirements actually transforming teacher education, and actually I think Sac State used them in that way. To what extent, though, are these requirements simply getting added into an untransformed education so people can then check the box and say we did that? The National Association for Multicultural Education was founded in 1990, and I remember in its earliest conferences, I was sitting next to Donna Golick in one of these conferences, and she said, "See that man over there? He's a spy." What are you talking about? Apparently, conservative organizations, when they heard about the founding of NAME, were concerned that a revolution was being plotted, and they wanted to come see what it is. I think it's almost a little bit not to a credit of NAME that we no longer have spies showing up. And I was kind of wondering, as I looked out at the size of this crowd, if there are people who come here to try to see what things are being plotted. Actually, if spies show up to see what you're doing, that means you're doing it right. So the term critical multicultural education then began to appear in the 1990s as a way of distinguishing between the sort of more benign, domesticated versions of multicultural education that focused on changing attitudes and focused only on culture, versus the versions of multicultural education that recognized its historic roots in challenging racism, and that also connected challenging racism, colonialism, and capitalism, and looked to social change strategies as organizing, not just changing teacher attitudes. Later in my workshop, which is on looking back, I'll be kind of linking the current ethnic studies movement back with the roots in multicultural education. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Are you set? All right. I first want to say thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I can't believe it's been 40 years of doing this work in one way or another. The first time that I did anything around cultural issues was when I was a community college student, and we were really trying to understand how culture was affecting students, and I was a research assistant. And I can't believe that I'm getting, first of all, this old, but also, just so many years of continuing. And I don't think there will ever be a time when we don't have to think about these issues. Let me begin there. Because human beings will always be struggling around issues of power and trying to struggle around what it means to be fair and just in the world. But that's it. Thank you to Dale, thank you, Margarita, thank you to Jenna, the committee, all the people that have made this possible. I'm going to go ahead and start a presentation that is just to help me to stay on track, because there's a lot of issues that I want to raise, and I think this is the easiest way for me to do it. So I'm inviting you to come on this little journey with me for about 15 minutes and be together in spirit. The trauma of historical and contemporary oppression continues to be a major concern, or should be a major concern, within the multicultural education community today. In that the hatred and violence of oppression does not only impoverish the lives of our children and communities, but impoverishes the lives of all human beings. However, it's impossible to move consistently towards genuine healing and transformation within multicultural education if we are unwilling to recognize and contend with the depth to which colonizing oppression distorts our humanity and betrays our struggles for freedom and equality within schools, universities, and the larger society. For more than 50 years, communities of color have worked to ameliorate the impact of poverty and racism on our lives. This was and should remain the central purpose of multicultural education today. Toward this, we have called for educational programs that are bilingual, bicultural, for teachers and administrators and university professors who are from our own communities. Still today, over 80% of teachers are white in schools. So with all of this work that we've been doing, there's ways in which the teaching force is not changing in ways that the population of children are changing. With more and more children of color, we should have more and more opportunities out there, and yet the teaching force continues to be predominantly white. There's been calls for prompt responses to acts of institutional racism against our children, youth, and communities, for adequate educational facilities, and for textbooks and curricula that reflect and honor the histories and cultural knowledges that have been historically erased and silenced, even with all the work that has been done around multicultural education. In essence, we have fought so that education would not remain homogeneous white zones of psychological trauma, but instead reflect healthy, just, and loving environments that genuinely reflect the growing diversity of this society. Yet despite consistent efforts to transform education at all levels, social and material conditions of institutionalized racism manifest as racism, as class inequalities, patriarchy, and other forms of discrimination persistent in communities of color. So we can talk about less prejudice or less, that we wouldn't have Donald Trump as president. We would not have Donald Trump as president if we were in fact so just and so open to diversity in this country. Continue to deal with high dropout rates, with the school-to-prison pipeline, conditions of poverty prevail. Through an unjust system of paternalism, elitism, meritocracy, and unacknowledged hatred of our communities, we continue to be systematically excluded and maligned in ways that perpetuate and reproduce racialized policies and practices that still ignore today the brutal realities that persist and that have been intensified by this administration. This is well enacted through microaggressions and macroaggressions linked to class, to race, to gender, to sexuality, physical ability, and religious affiliation. No matter how we slice it, the consequences of the great tragedy of oppression in this society and around the world are marked by social, material, psychological, and spiritual trauma. The difficulties our students experience today continue to be fueled by an obstinate allegiance to an abstracting intellectualism and a racialized culture of rewards and punishment linked to myths of accountability and social mobility that rely on limiting measurements of students as the answer to ameliorating the opportunity gap. Dehumanizing practices and policies of testing, of assessment, and promotion continue to be employed to sift and sort students, to determine who's worthy of opportunity. In this way, educational inequalities are legally justified through so-called evidence-based practices, practices still steeped in the colonizing epistemology that was responsible for genocide, for slavery, for colonization, and the impoverishment of the majority of the world's population. Fundamental problems that students of color face then are not situated within our communities. It is not situated in the color of our skin or in our culture. The problems lie in the perpetuation of the debilitating educational policies, structures, and relationships that on one hand cause students to become frustrated, alienated, powerless, and dispirited, and on the other hand perpetuate unacknowledged forms of hatred that manifest as explicit forms of prejudice and discrimination. Yet rather than to move toward transformative interventions that go to the root of the violence and trauma that the fear and hatred of differences has engendered, subaltern communities are blamed for our own difficulties and viewed through a deficit lens, sometimes even by our own people. The result is dominant theories of poor and working class communities of color that re-traumatize. Some examples at play is this cycle of poverty that people still talk about, or the broken windows argument. Consequently, problems within schools and communities continue to consciously or unconsciously be blamed for defective culture, that somehow there's, we're either defective in culture or still defective in genes as the culprit of inequality, instead of the institutional violence of patriarchy, poverty, racism, and homophobia perpetuated by colonizing montages of inferiority. What deficit theories, however, fail to engage is the manner in which colonizing institutional structures continue to impact the lives of our students and communities in ways that perpetuate the trauma and grow the natural human resiliency of our existence. Here, psychological notions of resiliency that we hear so often, as they are often articulated within education, can become a double-edged sword. Given that if faculty or students of color succeed, it is because we are somehow exceptional or resilient. And if we fail, then it's our own damn fault that we fail. In either case, mainstream notions of resilience are problematic in that these still place the burden of success on our students and faculty rather than on the institutions where it rightly belongs. Therefore, the difficulties in schools and community cannot be understood nor transformed from without a willingness to abandon old racializing myths and stereotypes about who we are and how we are perceived. This requires that we work to identify and challenge and dismantle what Iris Marion Young called the 5 phases of oppression, namely the manner in which policies and practices today still perpetuate exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural invasion, and violence in the lives of students, faculty, and communities. And particularly these happen in impoverished communities. And I think that we cannot even be thinking about anything related to social justice unless we're dealing with the economics of the reality. Key here is that we recognize that we cannot struggle against oppression within multicultural education programs without understanding that all forms of oppression are fundamentally interconnected, interrelated, and intersectional. We can, for example, try to pick apart racism from other forms of oppression, but this only creates false hierarchies about who is the most oppressed. This reductive approach is not the answer as we have learned in the last 50 years. Moreover, given our human interdependence, as long as any community is oppressed, our capacity to love and heal the wounds of our oppression will be restricted by the internal and external hatred that tyranny engenders. Moreover, multicultural education cannot work to overcome oppression in our society without confronting the perverted capitalist logic and structure of accumulated greed, exclusion, not only that attempts to control or eliminate all cultural views that are outside its control, but also separates the relationship that exists between the material, between the political, and between the spiritual realms of our humanity. This alienating consequence is that human beings, particularly those seen as different, easily become things, objects to be controlled, to be manipulated, or be eliminated. In the process, our relationships with ourselves, each other, and the world easily become hardened and harsh. So now, more than ever, we exist as a disconnected humanity. The norm within our rapidly corporatized and technologized society, where the concept of friendship has lost all real meaning, replaced by the culture of selfies and an addiction to the pseudo-connection of social media and phone screens, to reflect increasing social anxiety and disempowerment. We have to think about this technology that we love so much. We also have to understand that that technology's origin was military. Maybe we don't think about this. We lose sight in terms of its impact on us and how we're losing more and more of a sense of on-the-ground reality as we're escaping into this virtual reality that is dangerous in many respects. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion of educators as healers here. In response, many multicultural educators have begun to engage ourselves as cultural healers, embracing a decolonizing praxis of education. We work to disrupt Eurocentric epistemologies that privilege a way of teaching and learning that's predicated on what they call the banking form or method of education, which distances students from their learning by viewing them as somehow blank slates or containers to be filled. This speaks to a colonizing pedagogy that uses assimilating dogmas and norms and authority and doctrines and codes of power and protocols to silence and suppress the cultural sensibilities of the other, even within the context of multicultural education programs, particularly by those who deny their privilege or ambitiously seek the recognition and rewards from the very institutional apparatus that made multicultural education necessary in the first place. Here we are reminded of David's words. The conflict lies in the choice between being wholly themselves or being divided, between rejecting the oppressor within or not rejecting them, between human solidarity or alienation, between following prescriptions or having choice, between being spectators or actors, between acting or having the illusion of acting through the action of the oppressors, between speaking out or being silent, castrated in the power to create and recreate, in their power to transform the world. This is the tragic dilemma of the oppressed, which their education must take into account, which we must take into account in our work. In response, multicultural education scholars and activists of color over the years have worked to shatter colonizing beliefs that dehumanize our students and our communities, seeking decolonizing approaches that defy the Western epistemological lens of conquest. At the core of this argument is deep recognition of the manner in which racism is carried out through implicit and explicit discriminations and recriminations to such an extent that mainstream educators are often unable to listen or hear or feel our cultural truths beyond enforcing or projecting their biased notions upon us, often rendering our students and communities unheard and unseen. In response, the voices of educators as cultural healers have emerged from tireless navigation through dehumanizing conditions of silence and isolation in a quest to dismantle distorted perceptions placed upon us. This works to counter colonizing pedagogical values that continue to promote a culture of forgetting, in contrast to multicultural education, which is founded on a revolutionary culture of remembering. This culture of forgetting signals pedagogical aspects or spaces of colonizing and restricted education where our children are taught to reject our native tongue and uncritically adopt a mainstream language and cultural system that is imposed upon them by the dominant culture of schooling. In the past, this went under the guise of Americanization, and although this term is seldom used today, its colonizing logic of exclusion continues to shape the education of working class students of color at every level of the educational enterprise. But about this, Frantz Fanon argued, colonization is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grips and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. In direct contrast, educators and leaders seek liberatory approaches that honor the cultures, the languages, and histories of our students and our communities. We then, as cultural healers, offer our students and communities decolonizing possibilities and inspiration that Mel Hooks called the authority of our own experience, the sense that there's a wisdom, whether anyone else believes that there's wisdom there or not, that wisdom exists in our history and in our cultural realities. In this way, multicultural education, then over the years, has launched fundamental critiques that challenges to oppressive educational practices, and that we strive in our pedagogical perspectives to be firmly anchored in a decolonizing sensibility of our existence. Central to this is recognition that the only way we can transform the world is in the presence and truth of fully embodied selves. It requires walking through the fire of oppression and acknowledging the manner in which the hatred, violence, of poverty, of patriarchy, and racism have wounded our people and our communities, but also taking us beyond this woundedness to the cultural wisdom and communal power of our interdependent existence. As we walk through the fire of oppression, our decolonizing pedagogy opens the field for centering our cultural wisdom and histories of survival in ways that respect the deeply intimate and subjective sensibilities that emanate from our humanizing praxis as forces that nurture our healing and empowerment powerfully from beneath, sensibilities that have long awaited to be expressed in the world. It is precisely these revolutionary sensibilities that must fuel multicultural education in the present moment. As such, a decolonizing epistemology that shapes us as meaning makers who have chosen to ground our teaching in anti-colonial and anti-capitalist values. From our loving and liberating actions can emerge a powerful decolonizing approach to education that can heal us all. One where the underlying vision is that of humanizing and empowering communal life, grounded in the underlying message of Inakesh, tú eres mi otro yo, or the belief, I am because we are. And so often people say these words as it has become a cliche. We've got to move beyond the cliche and understand what it means to see one another as you are part of me. Your well-being is my well-being. That is the way that we have to come to this work. As such, the ethos of a decolonizing pedagogy calls for fundamental shifts in the way we make meaning about who we are in this world. It is then from this colonizing sensibility that we come to understand ourselves as healers and our teaching practice as a process of healing the wounds of our historical, contemporary oppression, healing signals and a process of making or becoming sound or healthy again in our individual lives and our lives as communities. This to say that we as multicultural educators have an incredible political, cultural, and spiritual responsibility to continue creating emancipatory spaces where our students, our parents, and community can come together in new ways that strengthen and sustain our capacities to nurture a more loving and just world. Moreover, at the heart of this work is a call to action. In many ways, youth today are demonstrating, showing us that they are willing to risk, to do something, to stand up, to speak out, to demand change. We can learn from their courageous, unfettered, and loving example in that we carry an internal wisdom, that they carry an internal wisdom that recognizes it is only through our embodied collective action against all forms of hatred that we can truly change the world. A book is not going to change the world. A book is not going to change. The relationships that we create is what changes the world.
So first of all, I'd like to start by talking about autism. Autism is the notion that one is superior based on their ability to hear, or based in the manner of behaving in the ways of one who hears. And so for spoken languages, it's related to looking down upon sign languages. This terminology was created by Humphreys in 1977. I grew up using sign language. Sign language is my first language. In our signing communities, we live that daily. We see the experience and the impact of autism on our daily lives. And so this is an important terminology that I want to make sure is addressed here. I'll discuss more of the history of oppression for deaf people and signing communities in the afternoon session. Signing communities came into being as part of resistance to hearing systems of oppression and hearing narratives. And I want to make a clarification about sign language. Sign language itself is not universal. Sign languages are not an artificial language. They embody their own linguistic structure and syntax. And here in the United States, we see American Sign Language is the language most dominantly used. But I do want to emphasize that we have various sign languages that are used within the United States and around the world. The language of American Sign Language is often romanticized. And we have to be careful not to overlook the fact that it's a language on par to that of any other spoken language. I went to Gallaudet University, which is the only liberal arts university in the world for deaf individuals in Washington, D.C. I was there during the Deaf President Now movement. How many of you have heard of that Deaf President Now movement? I see a few hands. This occurred back in 1988. Deaf students protested because they wanted to have a president for the university who was deaf. I was there during that movement. They finally elected a deaf president. But what I noticed about the leadership during that time and during that movement was that they were all white. I didn't see any deaf leaders who resembled me. Any deaf Chicanics leaders, any deaf leaders of color involved with the movement. As I progressed through my undergraduate years, I noticed experiences of racism, I noticed experiences of sexism. And so often we look at signing communities and think that there's the solidarity amongst those communities, but we still struggle internally with different forms of oppression. And as I look back into my own experience growing up, I went to a deaf school, deaf residential school. And at the time, I was not aware of those different forms of oppression and how they impacted my daily life. But as I look back, I can see how those narratives impacted me, and I can see the importance of discourses surrounding intersectionality. And when I look at deaf and hard of hearing students in schools, the curriculum is predominantly Eurocentric. I started teaching in deaf studies for deaf and hard of hearing students within the K-12 setting. And as I reviewed the curriculum there, again, I saw the focus was on white deaf leaders, white deaf role models. I didn't see any deaf leaders who looked like me. And likewise, students of color, deaf students of color, didn't see any role models. They weren't represented in the literature either. So for over 20 years at deaf schools and deaf education, and going to a variety of trainings and conferences, and I continue to seek out those spaces where I can find colleagues who are in a similar field as mine in multicultural education. And to be alone in this journey, to be the only one, is very isolating. I value those intersectional identities that I hold, and I want deaf children to value their intersectional identities as well, not just the identity of being deaf. Within the field of multicultural education, I continuously seek resources. I seek out organizations. And maybe some of your work has been involved in that. And there are a variety of resources that are wonderful and foundational, and yet, I don't see my people represented. I don't see deaf people of color in those discourses. When I look at videos and resources that are offered, particularly online resources, often they're not captioned. They're not accessible. And when they are, the representation is not there for deaf people of color. And representation matters. I'm one of very few deaf people of color who has a PhD. There are 13 all over the country. There's only 13 Black deaf with PhDs. So all of us collectively have a responsibility to make sure that deaf children of color are included and have the opportunity to become our future leaders. It's also important for us to take stock of our hearing privilege. I want you to include that vocabulary and recognize that vocabulary, that of hearing privilege and autism. These are important terms for you to consider, for you to acknowledge. And I believe that once we can acknowledge systems of hearing privilege and autism, that our communities can come together. Historically, signing communities have been oppressed by hearing communities. Deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled communities have been separated from the discourses that are within these environments. They're not welcome to join the table because of you and because of that work. So we need to work on becoming more inclusive. I need to heal. I need to find my space here too. And I want to offer that for deaf students of color all over the nation as well. And it means that I'm asking you directly to join in solidarity with me to resist racism and autism and linguicism and all forms of discrimination. That has to happen together for healing to occur. Someone once said that the limit is not in the sky, the limit is in their mind. And I strongly and firmly believe that the mind is connected to the heart. Thank you.
Before everybody gets restless and starts to move out, I think there's a formal thank you, but I'd like to just thank all of the keynote speakers today. It's been such a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with two old friends and one new friend, and to just hear this really magnificent, rich, intellectual and activist history that we are all, by virtue of being here today, a part of, and I hope you sort of set down your roots if you haven't already done so in this amazing tradition of social justice. I would like to invite, if you didn't get an email from us, or you didn't open the email, we can tell this now these days with modern technology, thanks to the military. If you are a College of Education alumni, we would like to welcome you back today at a reception just right after this conference in your old and familiar home, Eureka Hall. Still kind of looks the same, probably as when you graduated. So from 3:15 to 4:15, come on over, let us feed you and find out what you've been doing since you left our lovely building. And with that, I turn the mic over to our conference organizers.
All right, so the first thing we want to do is really give our keynotes another big round of applause, please.